Two guys from the plant retired the same year I did. Randall, line supervisor, 31 years. Eddie, quality inspector, 28. Both of them had been saving. Both of them had good pensions coming. Both of them walked out the same gate within 6 months of me, and they both thought they had it figured out. 2 years later, Eddie came to me. Not to complain. Eddie wasn't a complainer. But he had a look I recognized from the floor when a machine was running, and you knew the sound wasn't quite right, but you couldn't name the problem yet. He sat at my kitchen table and said, "Mike, something is draining. I don't know what." He laid out his accounts. I looked at them. I knew exactly what was happening. Randall never called. He didn't need to. The difference between Randall and Eddie wasn't the size of their savings. It was the shape of how their accounts were set up, and what that shape was costing them every month without anyone noticing, including Eddie. I'm Mike Decker. I spent 36 years diagnosing problems on production floors. In retirement, I applied the same method. Here's what I found. If you want straight talk about what retirement actually looks like from the inside, not advice, not projections, just what I lived and what I watched, subscribe to this channel. This is like having a retired friend who tells you what it actually looks like. I'm not going to tell you what to invest in. I don't know your situation. I'm not qualified to give that kind of advice. And honestly, even if I were, that's not what this is about. What I'm going to tell you is what I watched drain people I know. 4 types of account behaviors that I saw in my own retirement and in the retirements of the people closest to me. 4 things that looked fine on paper and cost people real money in practice. I'm going to tell you exactly what they were and how I found them, because that's what I'd want someone to have told me. It was a Tuesday morning in October, about 6 months into retirement, and I was in the garage. Not working on the Mustang, just looking at it. That happens sometimes. You go out there with the intention of doing something, and instead you end up standing in the middle of the garage with a cup of coffee going cold in your hand, looking at this thing you spent 11 years rebuilding, and you're not sure what the morning is supposed to be. I pulled out the legal pad. I've kept legal pads on every project I've ever run. It's just how I track work, how I think on paper. This one was the Mustang pad, going back to 2011 when I picked up the body shell from a guy over in Akron. 11 years of parts costs, labor costs, the occasional expense for a weekend at a show. I looked at the early years, 2011, 2012, 2013, when I was still working 60 hours a week and had almost no time and was buying parts in bursts whenever I could, paying whatever the asking price was because I didn't have the time to negotiate or wait for a better deal. Urgent money, fast decisions. Then I looked at the last 2 years. Retired. More time than I'd had in 3 decades. And the spending on the car had slowed down, which made sense because the major work was done. But I noticed something else. The way I was spending had changed. I was being more deliberate about some things and completely careless about others. I was sitting on more cash than I needed for the car because I kept feeding the Mustang fund out of habit. And the money was just sitting there waiting for an expense that might not come for 6 months. At the same time, there were other places where money was moving that I hadn't looked at carefully in 2 years. That's what started the diagnostic. And on a production floor, once you start the diagnostic, you don't stop until you've traced every symptom to its source. The first thing I found was the account I thought of as the safety account. Basic savings. Same bank I'd been with since 1987. I had a number in there that I kept as a floor, a minimum I wouldn't go below, a cushion for anything that went sideways. Working at the plant, this made sense. You're on a production floor, equipment breaks, things go wrong. Sometimes the unexpected costs several $1,000s, and you need to be able to cover it without disrupting your regular budget. The plant mentality about this is, always have a spare part. You don't wait for the machine to fail and then order the part. You keep a spare on the shelf because downtime costs more than the part. I had applied that mentality to my savings account for 36 years. And it made sense while I was working. It made sense when I was making a paycheck every 2 weeks and my expenses had a certain predictable shape. In retirement, it stopped making sense. And here's why. The floor I was keeping in that account was set for a life that no longer existed. It was set for emergency costs that looked like plant emergencies. A truck breaking down when I had to get to work. A roof repair that couldn't wait because I couldn't afford to miss a week. A medical thing that had to be handled right now because I couldn't take time off. When I retired, most of those urgent timelines went away. I had more flexibility about when things got fixed and how. And the amount I was keeping in that account, the amount I was protecting as a floor, was generating almost nothing, sitting there being safe, while I was paying attention to other accounts and not to this one. I don't know exactly how many years I'd been maintaining that balance at the level it was at, without thinking about whether the level still made sense. It was just a habit. I had the amount, I didn't touch it, I moved on. And I will tell you, the cost of that habit, when I finally ran the numbers on what that money had been sitting there not doing for a number of years, was not a number I was comfortable with. I'm not going to say what it was. I'll say it was enough to remind me that comfortable habits have a price, and you don't see the price until you stop and look. The second account I found was the one I called the emergency account. Different from the safety account, this one was specifically for what I thought of as plant-scale emergencies. Major HVAC failure, foundation problem, flooded basement, the kind of thing where a contractor shows up with a number that has 5 digits in it and you have to write a check today. I had kept this account funded and separate for over 20 years. It gave me peace of mind, and I stand by having had it. But here's what happened in retirement. The emergencies were different. The house didn't flood. The foundation was fine. The HVAC ran another 2 years after I retired on the same unit I'd had since 2015. The emergencies that actually came were smaller and more routine. A medical bill here, a car repair there, things that the regular monthly budget could handle with a little adjustment. The big-ticket emergency account sat there, untouched, for 26 months while I was dipping into the regular budget for things it should have been handling. What I mean by that is this. I had money earmarked for emergencies that were theoretical, while actual costs were coming out of my everyday account because I was mentally protecting the emergency fund. The duplication, the psychological separation between the emergency fund, which I can't touch, and the regular budget, which I have to manage, was costing me the use of money that was sitting idle. I wasn't getting the benefit of having it because I was protecting it from expenses that were perfectly appropriate for it to cover. I had trained myself so well to protect that account that I stopped asking whether I was protecting it from the right things. The third account is the one that embarrassed me most when I finally saw it. Karen had set up a household management account years before I retired. Bill payments, utilities, the regular recurring stuff. She managed it. I didn't look at it closely. This is not a criticism of Karen. She managed it well. But what I found when I sat down with both of our accounts side by side for the first time in a long time was duplication. There were subscriptions we were both carrying. There were services we were both paying for under different accounts that were doing the same thing. One under the household account, one that I was paying for separately because I'd set it up before the household account existed and never canceled it. There were 2 accounts with different banks that were both set up for overdraft protection and both charging maintenance fees. These things don't look like much individually. A $9 a month subscription, a $12 maintenance fee, the quarterly charge for something I'd signed up for in 2017 and hadn't thought about since. But when I pulled them all out and laid them on the kitchen table, Karen sitting across from me, both of us looking at this list, the total was not small. And neither of us had caught it because neither of us had looked at both accounts at the same time and compared them. We'd each been managing our piece efficiently, without anyone looking at the whole picture. That's a failure of system design, and I recognized it the second I saw it. On the plant floor, when 2 machines are doing the same function in the same line without anyone noticing, that's a redundancy problem. It's usually the result of a process that evolved over time without a review, with each addition making sense in its own moment without anyone stepping back to ask whether the whole still made sense. That's exactly what our account structure had become. It evolved. Nobody reviewed the whole. Things duplicated. The fourth account was the Mustang Fund. And this one is the one I'm most personal about because it was the account I cared about most psychologically, and the one I'd managed least carefully. Every project needs a budget. The Mustang had been getting a monthly allocation to the Mustang Fund for about 9 years, deposited separately, earmarked for parts and work. And for the first several years of that, the fund was lean. I was drawing it down almost as fast as I was building it because the car needed a lot of work. But then, somewhere around year 7 or 8, the major work was done. The car ran. The restoration was substantially complete, and the monthly allocation kept going into the Mustang Fund, and I kept not spending it at the rate it was coming in because there was less to spend on. By the time I retired, the Mustang Fund had grown to a number that was significantly more than any plausible project cost in the next 5 years. It was just sitting there, growing, and I was letting it grow because it felt good. Because having money set aside for the car, the project I loved, the thing I'd worked on for 11 years, made me feel secure in a way that was emotional rather than rational. The account was a symbol before it was a financial instrument, and I had been feeding the symbol without asking whether the symbol needed that much feeding. What I learned from diagnosing my own retirement finances the same way I'd diagnose a machine is this: symptoms are not the problem. Symptoms are information about where to look. The symptoms I was seeing, the vague sense that money wasn't going as far as I'd planned, the uncomfortable feeling I had but couldn't locate, the gaps in the monthly picture that didn't quite add up, those symptoms pointed me to the accounts. And what the accounts showed me was not a crisis. It was a system that had been designed for a life I was no longer living. When you diagnose a machine problem, you always start with, what has changed? Because machines don't usually fail in vacuum. They fail because something in the operating conditions shifted and the machine was configured for the old conditions. That's exactly what had happened with my retirement finances. My operating conditions had changed completely the day I retired, and my account structure was still configured for the plant. Too much cash parked as a spare part. Emergency funds sized for emergencies that were no longer coming. Duplicate coverage built up over years of parallel management, and a project fund that had become a psychological comfort object rather than a budget. When I laid it all out for Karen, she said something that I've thought about since. She said, "I knew something was off. I just didn't know it was this specific." She'd felt the imprecision without being able to locate it, the same way you feel a machine running slightly wrong before you can hear the cause. What she saw, looking at the whole picture, that I hadn't seen looking at my piece, was how the duplication had built up. She saw it from the household side. I saw it from the Mustang and emergency side. Neither of us had been looking at both. I restructured. Not dramatically. I'm not a person who does things dramatically. But I simplified. I consolidated what was duplicating. I reset the safety floor to reflect my actual retirement conditions rather than the plant conditions I no longer had. I started pulling from the emergency fund for appropriate expenses instead of protecting it from the world. And I let the Mustang Fund serve the car rather than the comfort it had been providing. I talked to Phil about this. Phil retired 3 years before me, electrician, worked a manufacturing plant in Mansfield. He's a precise man like most electricians. They don't guess at wiring, they trace the circuit. I told him what I'd found and he was quiet for a minute and then he said, "I have that account." He didn't say which one. He just said it the way you say something when you recognize yourself in a description you weren't expecting. I have that account. That's why I'm telling this story. Not to tell you what to do. You know your situation better than I do, and your numbers are different from mine. But because I think a lot of people who spent their whole careers keeping systems running are now in retirement running a system they inherited from their working selves and haven't looked at carefully since the transition. Because the transition was busy, and the accounts were set up, and everything was running, and running is not the same as running right. I thought I'd feel something definitive when I retired. I felt like I'd forgotten something in my locker. That feeling, it turned out, was information. I want to tell you about one more thing I found, and it's the one that surprised me most when I finally named it. It's not exactly an account. It's a behavior pattern that was costing me across all the accounts, and I didn't see it until I saw the four accounts together. I was managing money in retirement the same way I'd managed it at the plant, which means I was managing it for stability and continuity, not for what was actually going on. At the plant, stability and continuity were the goals. You wanted the line running at capacity, no surprises, nothing changing too fast. You optimized for predictability. You built buffers and kept them full, and you didn't change the system unless something broke. Retirement is not a production floor. The line doesn't run the same way every week. The costs don't follow a shift schedule. The system you need in retirement is designed for adaptation, not for continuity, because your life in retirement is changing in ways your working life didn't. Health changes, activities change, what you spend on and why changes. The house you bought when the kids were young is aging at the same rate you are, and it has different needs every year. And the accounts I had were all built for stability, all built to stay the same, all designed not to be touched unless something was wrong. Nothing was wrong, but I wasn't getting what they could have given me because I was protecting them from uses they were perfectly well suited to serve. That's the underlying thing that connects all four accounts. The accounts were fine. My relationship with the accounts was the problem. I had a retirement financial structure that was doing exactly what I designed it to do, which was to behave the way a working person's finances are supposed to behave, cautiously and predictably. And in retirement, cautious and predictable had started to mean inefficient and invisible. Karen said something to me about a year after I'd done the restructuring that I think about sometimes. She said, "You're more relaxed about money now than you've ever been." And she was right. And the reason she was right surprised me when I understood it. I was more relaxed because I knew where things were, not because I had more, because I'd finally looked at the whole system at once, and I understood what I was looking at. That's what I'd want for you. Not a specific plan, I don't know your situation, but the habit of looking at the whole system at once, at regular intervals, and asking the question a plant floor manager asks when something sounds slightly off. What has changed in the operating conditions? And is the system still configured for the life I'm actually living? Here's what I want from you in the comments. Not your account numbers, not your balance, not your strategy. Just this. How long have you been carrying an account that you set up for a life you're no longer living? What's the account that's been on autopilot longest without anyone looking at whether it still makes sense? Write it in the comments. Not the number, just the type. I guarantee you'll see yourself in other people's answers. Subscribe if you haven't. This channel is about what retirement looks like from the inside. Not advice, not projections, just what it actually looks like when you're in it. Like having a retired friend who tells you the real version. See you next week.